else to join in. Just before we get rolling with the presentation and discussion of chapter, I want to say 11, might be 12, on work. I just want to remind you, registration is going to happen, I guess in a few weeks. I think the 26th, 27th in there. Just remind you, there are a number of sociology classes, and I know we'd be happy to see you again in those. Just quickly, what am I going to do here? Quickly present to you. Okay, there you go. So again, if you go to your Google, or your Eckerd rather, my Eckerd, and obviously it looks a bit different for you, but check out your class schedules. And remember to be in touch with your mentors for this. They all are looking forward to hearing from you remotely. Fall semester 2020 is live now. And you can see, I'll make that a little bit bigger for you. Professor Flaherty will be teaching Self and Society and a course on time. Professor Miller will be teaching a course on family and intimate relationships, which really gets in a lot more depth into family dynamics and family change that we're going to talk about that a bit in here in a couple of weeks. And then I'll be teaching a theory course as well. So if you've been interested in any of that Marx and Weber and Durkheim and symbolic interaction and all that, delve into a lot more depth and a lot more theories about society. Again, if this is of interest of you, but again, you've been a really high-performing class, and I'd be certainly more than happy to see more of you. Okay, so today, again, I'll be keeping check on the chat window. If you have questions or comments as we go along, please pop in over there and let me know what's up, what you're thinking, what you want to know. Otherwise, I'll mostly be going off of these slides here. So let me begin the presentation slideshow from the beginning at the beginning. Okay, so again, we're talking about work, and this is pretty closely aligned with what we were talking about last time, economic issues, but specifically with respect to the experience of work, there are a whole host of associated issues and problems. The first thing we do really want you to know about work is that it has changed significantly over the last 150 years, but even really, in the last 30, 40 years, the trends have continued where work in the agriculture industry has declined significantly as a proportion of the population. So that's what we call the primary sector that includes agriculture, but also what we would call extraction. Extraction being things like fishing, mining, logging, timber, those kinds of things. That was a much more significant part of the American economy early on, and it has clearly declined. Agriculture specifically has declined quite a bit. Should note, though, with agriculture, part of the reason for that decline is not necessarily that we are producing less agricultural goods, but that we have largely automated the agricultural process. Rather than having small family farms, we have large industrial farms now, where we have these gigantic machines that can extract, tons of wheat in an hour. So we've moved from that kind of work to work in the secondary sector, and you can sort of see that line increasing here from the mid 19th century to the mid 20th century. That secondary sector is, basically you think about factories making stuff. And that, rose through the mid 20th century, but then that began to fall off after the 1950s, or really even during the 1950s. And now most people who work in the service sector, or what we call the tertiary sector. And with the tertiary sector, you have to remember that this includes all kinds of services. So the professions in general are services. So lawyers, doctors, college professors are providing a service, but then so is anybody working in the food service industry, or the clerks at your local grocery store, right? All of those kinds of jobs count as services, as do cleaning people or the cooks at the cafeteria. So we call it the tertiary sector. We lump it all together, but it includes really quite a diversity of different kinds of jobs. And let me see, let me do this way now. Okay, so I'm going to stop presenting, and I'm going to change to a single window. Oops. All right, there you go. Okay, so again, things have changed significantly in the economy, and one way to really frame that, first of all, on I guess a sort of a positive note, part of that growth in the tertiary sector comes from the information revolution. So the ability of people to do computer jobs from their desk at home. That's a significant change that has contributed to the growth in the tertiary sector for a lot of folks. But at the same time, a lot of the explanation of that trend, especially this trend in the black line here, the decline in industry, is about deindustrialization. So it's not necessarily simply that there are more jobs in general and more of them are in the services. It means that there's less jobs in factory work in America. And again, that's since the 1950s, and in large part that's because factories have closed in the US and moved overseas. Should say overseas, or if you look at this picture here, many of these jobs have moved to Mexico. So this is a maquiladora, which is just a kind of a factory that American firms run just over the border. I think they're making blue jeans here in northern Mexico. That's where a lot of the industrial work in the world has moved. And there are several reasons for that. Part of it is that unions do not have much power in these developing nations where factories are located now. So firms have to offer fewer benefits to workers, makes it a lot cheaper, and the wages in these places are considerably lower. So rather than paying Americans relatively expensive wages, they can pay low wages to overseas workers, save a lot of money, and of course sell their products at lower prices and therefore be more competitive with each other. A large part of the reason for that, though, is that the I guess you'd call it the order of the globe has changed considerably since the 1950s, right? So we call this process generally globalization, and that's in terms of everything from communications technologies. So it's easy for at this point, actually, you can get stuff made in China without ever having to go to China, because you can send them plans that are drawn on a computer for a product, and a factory in China will make that product, right? That's dependent in large part on technological advances, but also advances in anything from shipping technology to airplanes and all that. So really lots of economic activity crosses borders now. I should also mention this decline in the industrial sector here speaks a bit to the current problems that we're having along with COVID-19 in terms of being able to provide, industrial goods. America doesn't provide much in the way of goods anymore. And in general, in normal times, we look at that as at least a somewhat good thing, because it means that we could produce things like the PPE, right? Personal protective equipment. Those 3M masks can be really cheaply produced in China. But it also means that, in a time when all the borders are closed, we have much less industrial capacity than we once did. So now you see people really struggling to get or to produce those kinds of goods, because we simply don't do that in America here anymore. You should also note, this is something that's been going on since the 1950s. This deindustrialization, but it hasn't ended by any means. So there are still factories in America, but still the trend is for factories to close. So last spring, GM closed a plant in Youngstown, Ohio, for example. That cost 1,700 jobs. I'm just gonna go over and check if you guys have questions at this point. There's two things. All right, how do I think globalization will be? Okay, we got there. All right, good. Yeah, it is an interesting question, though. Global quantum, this could be, it's a whole new baby boom. The thing is, though, it is an interesting question, though, about what the future holds after COVID-19, because there would, at least I have some question of, now that we've seen that we're so dependent on global supply chains, will there be some more demand for domestic production, at least of certain products? Again, really remains to be seen. There's lots of different political questions that do come up now. Okay, so here's a bit again of this explanation of why to go global. If you look at, and this is just the minimum wage. This is not the average hourly wage by workers. So expect that to be certainly considerably higher for the U.S. here, but somewhat higher in developing nations as well. And this is, by the way, this is just OECD countries. Again, those are the countries that are relatively well economically developed, and so this doesn't include certain countries that are really important in global production chains, like Pakistan or Malaysia. But even at this, you can see the U.S. And this is slightly dated. No, that really hasn't changed. The U.S. minimum wage of 7.25 an hour is considerably higher than that 62 cents an hour that you're required to pay a worker in Mexico, right? So when GM makes cars in Mexico, they can do it a lot cheaper. Also, though, we should note that expanding markets are part of the reason to go global. So it's not just that GM is making cars for American markets, they're making cars for global markets now. Apple iPhones are all around the world, and so it really doesn't necessarily make any logistical sense to try to make them in California, right? So they're making them in China and distributing them all over the world. And I mentioned this before, though, but part of the reason that we can do this globally now is that there is this better information technology structure that allows different companies to keep track of their production chains. This is, so now looking at the different kinds of work in a different way. And I should say that the text is fairly cursory on this theory, the theory of the primary versus the secondary labor market. And there really is quite a lot of writing and thinking about this in the sociological literature on work. And the big point that the textbook misses is that you can have, so the way the textbook kind of lays it out is that the primary labor market is mostly distinguished by the kinds of work that you do. So service work and things like waiting tables or janitorial work that would be in the secondary labor market, and better jobs would be in the primary labor market. The theory in general really doesn't speak to it in that way, though. The theory's really that what distinguishes these labor markets is how the work arrangement is set up. So you can have, and you see this especially in municipal work these days. So if you are, say, digging ditches or doing janitorial work, if you work for a city like the city of St. Petersburg, that's actually primary labor market work, because those jobs come with benefits. They come with relatively high wages. They come with a chance for promotion, and they're relatively long-term jobs. But if you're working in as a janitor at a factory that doesn't have unions, you're likely to be paid pretty low wages. There's little job security there, but also kind of an interesting point that people who think and write about this stuff have made is that the secondary labor market tolerates bad behavior. So if you show up late for a union janitorial job with the city, there is a series of consequences that follow with that. You will be punished and eventually fired if you're tardy on the regular basis. In the secondary labor market, that is less the case. And you can also think of things like landscaping jobs and those sorts of things where maybe you don't even show up to work one day. But there are so many people to fill those jobs that the secondary labor market really doesn't punish that sort of behavior as much. And so the theory also suggests that certain people sort of develop habits that force them into secondary labor market jobs, or that the secondary labor market reinforces certain kinds of bad habits that then make it very difficult for people to join the primary labor market. Wanted to sort of, because the textbook emphasizes Barbara Ehrenreich's work, I want to make sure you take Ehrenreich with a grain of salt. You know, so she has this book here. It's on my shelf. Nickeled and dimed, right? So on not getting by in America, you know, where she went and she did these jobs, like especially waiting tables, you know, in different places around America, and she found out that it sucks. And that's, I mean, yeah, that's true. But she did it in such a way that really doesn't speak, I think, authentically to the experience of working class Americans. So absolutely, you know, this point that you know, low wage service jobs don't pay well, and they're really unpleasant. You know, they're physically taxing. But on the other hand, she had never, as far as I can tell, she never worked a real day of manual labor before in her life, right? So you do need to sort of get in shape to do these sorts of jobs, and I don't think she was in the shape to do those sorts of jobs. And more importantly, though, she went into this, I guess, experiment. I don't really want to call it a sociological study. She went into this experiment with no social connections. I think the first place she does is like Key West. She just kind of drops into town with basically no money, and you know, finds a crappy job, and finds, like, you know, a little, you know, rent by the day room in a motel, and doesn't have social connections, and that's just not authentic to the experience of working class Americans. Not to say that there aren't some people who do that, and Florida is a little bit notorious for people who do that. So there are some people certainly who quit their, you know, their job in Ohio because they hate the snow, and then they move to Florida and they're miserable because they have no connections. But for the most part, people do rely on their social networks to get by. So rather than crashing on, well, rather than spending a lot of money on a cheap motel room, people will crash on each other's couches because they have those kinds of connections, you know, or if there are problems with daycare, they'll rely on people in their family or their social network. And so this really goes to my point here, that being poor takes skills, right? So being poor in America, this is not to say it doesn't suck, but for those of us who have done it, we know that you can do it without being constantly miserable and experiencing the kind of privations that Ehrenreich experienced, because she did this in a way that was really not just not authentic to the experience of the working class. Again, though, that's not to say that the working class in America isn't quite poor, and they really are, and especially, again, those secondary labor market jobs, you know, really make it difficult to get by. So, you know, you do end up having to crash on somebody's couch or to rely on people for childcare and those kinds of things. But people do it. It is possible. It ain't pleasant, but it's definitely more possible than Ehrenreich would suggest. Getting more specifically into the problems we associate with work, certainly health and safety is part of that. A lot of this now has been shifted into those jobs that are overseas. So if you look at a statistic like this, in China, of course, the Chinese have a much larger workforce than ours, but this is still disproportionate. About 38,000 Chinese die in the workplace every year, compared to only about 4,800 in the US. And again, if you go back historically, our numbers were more like China. So what we look at is really those primary and secondary sector jobs as being the most dangerous. So working in farming, working in factories is dangerous work. America, part of the reason, in addition to wages, that makes American factory production more expensive is that we have this little thing called the OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, that requires a lot of different safety precautions in the workplace. So, things like guards on assembly lines, so that you can't fall in and get your hair caught in the line and get killed. Yeah, I don't. We can tell stories. You may know stories. I definitely know stories of how people do still lose their lives in factory work in America. Very unpleasant, but again, it has gotten a lot better in America over the years. But still, this persists. So mining is still very dangerous. Farming is dangerous. Farming implements are sharp and heavy, and farmers do die every year. In some occupations, people exposed to chemicals, particularly carcinogenic chemicals that can give you cancer over the long term. People are exposed to radiation in certain jobs, including, in the medical field, x-rays and CT scans, those sorts of things. And as well, there's certain occupations that expose you to violent coworkers or patrons, so we know that workplace violence is a significant problem in America. I just kind of, as an example of bad things that happen, the Sago mine disaster is mentioned in your book. That was about 10 years ago now, I guess. 11 guys in a coal mine died. And the guy who ran it is this guy, who is Wilbur Ross, who's now the Secretary of Commerce in the Trump administration, right? So we should also note, people are making money off of these unsafe mines, and the reason that Wilbur Ross ran an unsafe mine that could kill 11 guys was that, he makes more money the less he adheres to safety regulations. And there is a calculus really that these businesses do in terms of how many safety regulations they choose not to follow, because following those regulations are expensive, and they're willing to sort of pay the fines and the extra insurance when bad things happen. Do want to mention as well, almost as an aside, but that these work problems of health and safety tend to be worse for men. So the more dangerous occupations tend to be male-dominated professions, or occupations rather, and to a small extent that explains some of the wage gap, because you do get what we sort of call hazard pay if you work in mining or one of these more dangerous occupations. Not everybody wants to go down into the mine because they recognize the dangers. And so people who do work in mines do get paid better than people with similar skill sets who don't go down. This is at a more, let me just check if you have any questions. There is a question. Yes. Is there a general, how much of the wage gap? I don't have that off the top of my head. I'm sorry, Sage. Look that up after class. I mean, it's small, we're talking, fractions of a percent, but there is, yeah, it is measurable and significant, but small. Oh yeah, so this is, yeah, at a more, I guess, not how to say it, like a less physical level, a more spiritual level of work problems is this problem of alienation. So in the Marxist rendering of this, and Marx wrote really, extensively about this problem. But the idea here is, as compared to, say, working on the family farm where we're all working together for each other and, we have real relationships with our coworkers, in capitalism, we're all just people in the workplace competing with each other, and work becomes a mindless chore, right? Especially, Marx was especially writing about industrial labor, right? So like tightening the nuts on a boiler that doesn't require much of your brain, doesn't require much skill. You're just doing it for a wage, and it's pretty hot, miserable stuff. And so you really don't feel that it is a vital thing, an important part of your life, except in as much as it allows you to keep eating. A sort of a different spin is the Weberian spin. So Max Weber, said that the real problem, and Weber's writing about 50 or 60 years after Marx. So Marx is writing in the mid 19th century, at really the kind of beginning of the height of the industrial era. Weber is writing sort of further down in the industrial era, but also at a time when you could look at things like banks that are really getting bureaucratized. And he was more focused on the rationalization aspect of these things. And so it wasn't so much for him that people are doing really hard manual labor, but that the labor that they even do at, say, a bank or a law firm doesn't really require much imagination on their part, right? It's just tick the numbers, follow the directions that you've been provided in your human resources manual, and you don't really feel you're making a significant contribution to the world. And of course, that is again the sort of maybe imagined opposition, the imagined point to which alienation is opposed, is that work should be, at least in theory or philosophically speaking, work should be something that is fulfilling. You should feel like your work is making a positive change in the world. You should feel that your work is, because this is something you spend much of your time doing, this is something that's significant to your identity. But if you're just ticking off boxes, you can't really feel that way. I should say, though, that ethnographic research, so even in factories, shows that people are, again, not quite as miserable as the sociological theory would sometimes tend to suggest. So ethnographies tend to show what I say here is unofficial workarounds, really so that people can partly have fun on the job, partly so that they can have better relations with each other. And so you do find, especially in ethnographies of factory work, people taking sort of unofficial coffee breaks and hanging out with each other and joking around. People do tend to make their work, if not making them feel like they're making a real contribution to the world, at least they're having a little bit of fun on the job. One of my favorite articles in this was it was called La Perruque. These people, French factory workers, who would sort of sneakily on the side make things for themselves. It was called the Peruk. I'm not sure what that translates as, but they would make these things on the side, like little dollhouse furniture kind of stuff, just to have fun, just to be able to use their creativity if they felt that their job didn't allow them to exhibit creativity. So people find these workarounds. People will sort of enjoy themselves, and try not to be alienated to whatever extent they can. This is another way of looking at this kind of problem of alienation, the McDonaldization of work. And so this is really specific to one theorist named George Ritzer. I haven't seen this too widely adapted, but it is a kind of a nice way to think about how jobs in general have changed if you compare all jobs to McDonald's work. And really, this does characterize kind of a surprisingly wide array of occupations now. It is similar, really, to what Weber was saying 100 years ago about bureaucratization, but essentially, jobs, employers try to make work as uniform and rule-based as possible to ensure, well, all of these things, right? So efficiency, so that things don't get wasted. You can even see this, obviously, the metaphor is about McDonald's. And if you look at McDonald's, relatively little material is wasted, right? So you don't have much like wasted beef or wasted French fries or wasted vegetables, because there are machines and procedures to make the use of all the raw materials as efficient as possible. There are timers on the fry machines and all that sort of thing to make sure that basically people are working as much of the time as possible, and there are procedures in place. If there aren't customers around, you don't get like a little break. You have other things that you can do, again, in the interest of efficiency. It's also in the interest of predictability and uniformity. And that's in terms of this idea that you can go to a McDonald's anywhere in the world and get a Big Mac, and it will be essentially the same thing. At least certainly across the United States. I guess there's some international variation. I don't know if any of you are there weird things in McDonald's around the world anymore? I don't know. I haven't been to a McDonald's overseas in a long time. And also, of course, automation. To the extent that it's possible. You've seen this now. I don't know if you've been to McDonald's recently, or one of these McDonald's. A lot of them are installing these kiosks now to actually take your order for you. So machines are doing the work that the human beings did. Again, McDonald's is the main metaphor here, but this does apply to all kinds of industries. So, at Eckerd, certainly we're resisting something like this in how we deliver our educational program. But if you went to an online university, if you went to one of the Kaiser universities or University of Phoenix online, they are more or less set up in this way, so that the teachers there really have to follow this kind of a model of delivering a uniform educational program to all of their students. And again, it's not just McDonald's in education, it's much of work in the 21st century. Temping has become a more important part of work life, and again, I'm putting this under the rubric of problems, but we needn't necessarily look at that. So there are certain people who do enjoy this flexibility. You as college students might find that taking on temp work is useful to you because you can't make a commitment now, for a year or two at a job, but you can go to something like Manpower Incorporated and get a job, cleaning up at a factory and make a few bucks over the summer, just over a couple of weeks. So there is some positive dimension to temping for a portion of the workforce. At the same time, though, there are a lot of folks who would rather have a long-term job and the stability and benefits that tend to come with long-term jobs, but that's not available to them. Again, that can be a benefit for some employees. It is generally a benefit to employers, though. So firms, to the extent that it's possible, like to use temporary workers because it allows them to work more cheaply and to expand their workforce only when they need that kind of expansion. A kind of a quick and easy example of this is all the hiring that department stores traditionally do around the holidays. The department store doesn't want to employ the same size workforce that they employ, in the weeks leading up to Christmas all year long, but they do need to add a few people to the workforce when things really do get busy. And then, of course, it's much cheaper for them to let those people go at the end of the holiday season. So temping has significantly expanded in the workforce over time. I did want to kind of show something like this, though, that overall job tenure, meaning the amount of time that an individual spends on a particular job, on an individual job, has not changed all that significantly over time. And so you may hear this, people, my uncle worked for 30 years for Chrysler and nobody works that long anymore at the same job. That's not so much true. So there was some decline through the 60s and 70s. But overall, and it's interesting too that this has a lot to do with women's entry in larger numbers to the workforce. But we see that the average job tenure has been hovering around 5 years, or the median job tenure rather, and ticked up a bit during the recession, to the extent that now this drop, and this continued for a few years, and of course I should mention all of this stuff is out the window now with the coronavirus impact on the economy. But all right, the drop in job tenure here was actually seen as a positive thing because the argument was that during and after the recession, people were hanging on to jobs that weren't paying very well or that weren't really great jobs because they were afraid that there wouldn't be other jobs, and this drop is when unemployment starts dropping and people start to be able to sort of look around more and find different jobs. So job tenure is not as straightforward as it's a good thing to work at a job for your whole life. Finally, not sure how to think about the gig economy. That's two odd words to stick together. Gig economy. Not sure quite what rubric to understand the gig economy under. We can sort of think about it like temping, though, at least in part, because this is super flexible. If you're schlepping groceries for shipped, you can do that for a couple of weeks between jobs or for a couple of hours in the afternoon. It's similar to temping, but it really needs, its own treatment. And I don't think there's enough, at least I haven't seen enough, to satisfy my wonderings about, what's really going on in the gig economy in terms of research. And comment, question, okay, yeah, and I mean, it is an interesting question. I think we'll get to some of the politics of it, but automation is an interesting question, and you see, I mean, I have politician friends who are really anti-automation on the liberal side of things. Of course, conservatives are always anti-regulation. You wouldn't want to regulate automation out of the picture. I do have some liberal friends who would like to see that, but I don't see that as really a mainstream liberal position, right? So really, it speaks more towards things like Yang's proposal to have guaranteed annual income, right? So rather than seeing automation as the problem, see it as associated with a whole other host of problems that can be alleviated through something like guaranteed income. But that's we can really go down a long road about talking. Isn't that a problem in and of itself?
In terms of making the rich richer, the conservative side with that, because automation doesn't require the same benefits required and wages, is what I was thinking. After that, that you didn't need to answer that because I had been kind of thinking about it. But I see how it could eliminate positions in the workforce, making it more so that the elite are directly getting their money.
Yeah, and then, it is an associated problem, right? Where that's exactly kind of how it shakes out. Is if rich people can then spend that money on machines, they will tend to make more money, and poor people will make less because they don't have jobs anymore, right? And of course, the conservative position is that that's just how the market works. And so we need to just let that happen. But that then, the argument goes, will encourage other people to innovate new kinds of jobs, new kinds of work, because the old ones have fallen by the wayside. Oh yes, the unemployment, right? So this is really on our minds now. This is, the chart of normal times, up until, I think this just goes through last quarter of 2019. You see that we have, interesting stuff. Let me talk about this, right? So some unemployment is normal, right? So there's always, we've reached a minimum, or we had reached a minimum of somewhere around 3% unemployment. And that's just looked at as being full employment from the standpoint of national economics, because that 3% of people are people who are, out of work, temporarily looking for new jobs, etc. Should mention, right, it's tied to economic cycles. So when recessions hit, people get unemployed. But what? This is the interesting thing to me. So throughout, in this period, this is the 2008-2009 recession, unemployment shot up considerably. But if we tracked it, you can see that the unemployment rate dropped significantly afterwards. What this tracks, though, is the labor force participation rate. So this is the number of people between 18 and 65 who are working. And the funny thing is that those people are not working as much as they used to. So throughout the 90s, the participation rate was, around 67%. Throughout the teens, though, it fell down to 62, 63%. And the real question is, why are those people permanently out of the workforce? And there's not really great answers for this yet. And the problem, a problem with this is that it's not represented in the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate of about 3% that we were looking at prior to last week was tied to it's about people who are out of work but looking for work. So that 3% number is 3% of the workforce who don't have a job right now but are looking for work. That doesn't include most of these people. So, by this measure, approximately, 36, 37, 38% of the adult workforce is not working. So the question is, who are these people? To some extent, they may be the disabled. They are partially older workers, so workers in their 50s or early 60s who have retired early. But we think, and people, disagree about how significant this is, but we think a significant proportion of these people are people who are simply discouraged. People who are permanently out of the workforce because they either lack the skills or lack access to the kinds of jobs that even make it worth it to work. That's not to say they don't do anything at all. They may be, fixing cars in their backyard, or doing different hustles online, that kind of thing, and not showing up in the official payroll statistics. But this really is an important question about our economy in general. Although I will say, since last week, everything's out the window. So, we've never, ever seen jobless claims this high, right? So 3.3 million people filed for unemployment last week. That's totally unprecedented, right? And, again, I'm not an economist. I can't tell you what the long-term picture is going to be here. But, obviously, part of this is people who are unemployed simply because, they've been told, they're in states like California, or I guess most of the country now really, that says, you have to stay at home. And so they can't do whatever work that they were doing. And so they're filing for unemployment. But then, of course, there are these ripple effects throughout the economy. Since nobody's driving anywhere, they need less people at gas stations. There's less people fixing cars. Anybody who worked, I'm friends with lots of musicians, they can't do whatever gigs they were lined up to do, and the people who work at the venues for the musicians, and so on and so forth. So that is fully 1% of the population filed for unemployment last week. This is, again, unprecedented. So we see this is the 2008-2009 recession. During recessions, of course, people apply for unemployment. Again, we've never seen anything like this, and what happens to the economy afterwards. There's a lot of people with a lot of time on their hands writing about this now. It obviously it remains to be seen just how and if, I guess, we can get the economy rolling again once the coronavirus is contained. But we're largely in uncharted territory. Of course, the concern for a lot of sociologists and more liberal economists is going back to this. There were a lot of people who were in some trouble before. You add on this 3.3 million people who were in less trouble, were working. Add that to the roles of non-working people. What will society be able to absorb this? And we just don't know. I'm sorry, I don't have good news for you. Checking that chat window again. Okay. Right. So this is, again, the problem of the missing workers, that 30, 36, 37% of people. So yes, partly it's about the aging population, partly it's about people who don't, it's interesting, and I think maybe better than talking about Ehrenreich would be some of the real ethnographic studies that have looked at why, for example, young parents don't work. Sometimes it's more expensive to have a job than to not have a job. When we're talking about working a minimum wage job in an urban area with a high cost of living, it's actually more expensive to do the commuting to work and pay for childcare than it is to not work, right? You actually end up losing money by going to a job. So that those low wages can really drive people out of the workforce. Again, this speaks, somewhat to the automation question. There is high worker productivity. More stuff is made per worker now, in terms of both goods and services. So really we require a smaller workforce. Again, outsourcing overseas decreases the size of the necessary workforce. And to some extent, because of the technologization of the workforce, people have difficulty transitioning to new jobs. So if you work a job for 10 years at a GM factory and then you get laid off, you might not have the skills that are necessary to get a new factory job somewhere else. And then there's just simply a psychological question here, of people being discouraged. Again, the GM Youngstown folks who got laid off, provided some good examples of this. People who are working pretty good paying working class jobs, finding that if they go someplace else after getting laid off, they're going to make half of what they were making before. That's just psychologically discouraging. It can force people, really to be in a headspace where they don't want to even try to work. And then part of the associated problem here is what we've called the low wage recovery. But again, who knows what this looks like in the coming years. But in the years since the 2008-9 recession, but again, that's kind of a continuation of a long-term trend. Wages have barely moved upwards for working class people. So you see the top earners, the 90th percentile and the 75th percentile, have moved up significantly in terms of weekly earnings. The median has barely moved at all, and people in the lowest wage group haven't moved up at all, which may, again, kind of drive some of them out of the workforce entirely. Mark, yeah, well, I hesitate a little bit to talk about Marxists again because so Sage's question is, I'm sure Marxists have something to say about all of this. Like there's a lot of Marxists. Well, I don't know if there are a lot of Marxists, in terms of proportional numbers, but there are different. So there are mainstream, Marxist economists who mostly focus on, the labor theory of value and things like that. Who say like, yes, capitalism is just getting better at exploiting workers, but they propose more of what you would call sort of traditional socialistic reforms. Again, things like guaranteed annual income or wage guarantees, raising the minimum wage, that sort of thing. There are also out there, though, people, Trotskyites, who are kind of a sub-tribe of Marxists. There are still Marxists out there who are looking for a revolution, right? So it's hard to just say, what the Marxists have to say, because there's quite a bit of variation amongst them. But yeah, I mean, and it's even, again, we'll get a bit more into the politics at the end, but it's a fairly mainstream leftist proposal that the minimum wage should be higher, that various safety net programs should be higher, and that taxes, especially on these highest earners, should be higher. I think that's almost across the board on the left, from your very middle of the road Democrats like Biden to your extreme Trotskyite Marxists. Other problems of work. I noticed that the text goes into a fairly great amount of depth about discrimination, both with respect to ethnicity and gender. I'm not going to go into that. We talked about that again earlier in the semester when we talked about these different kinds of inequality. But yes, of course, there is discrimination, both in terms of hiring and in terms of compensation, promotion. We know that there's something like a glass ceiling, although there's some dispute about that. But again, that is a work problem for a number of people. Further, though, let's go kind of just moving on. Deunionization is cast as a problem because unions did for and really ultimately for what I would call a short portion of U.S. labor history, really from the 20s or 30s through the 1960s, 70s, somewhat. Unions got, how to put this, they made work better for the working class because they engaged in collective bargaining. So collective bargaining means for bargaining for the entire workforce in a factory or an entire workforce that's working for a firm. Obviously, that is going to enable all the workers in general to get a better shake than if it's just the individual worker trying to negotiate benefits or a salary with the firm, right? The individual worker has much less power than the union does. So again, in that mid 20th century era, unions secured much higher wages for workers. A working class person with an 8th grade education could own a home and a car on a salary that they earn, in Detroit working for General Motors or in St. Louis working for Maytag, in these union jobs in mid 20th century America. But really, since the 1950s, that has declined considerably. And it's from both legislative changes that have made it harder for unions to do what unions do, but also certainly because of deindustrialization and globalization more generally. So partly this is a political question, but certainly partly it's a structural question. The bottom line, though, is that workers in the 21st century are much less likely to have a union or to have a union. This is just a map. I think this is still in the text of what we call right to work states, and you can see that this is something that spreads across the country historically. This begins in 1943 in Florida. Unusual for Florida to be the first in something, but there you go. But has spread across the country, even into fairly recent history. So it was originally a Southern thing, and it has spread across, so Michigan in 2012, Wisconsin in 2015. These right-to-work laws essentially make it much more difficult for unions to do what unions do. They, most especially with respect to unions, they forbid what we call a closed shop. They forbid a union to negotiate with a firm that everyone at the firm has to be a member of the union. And these right-to-work states make it so that they can't, they legally forbid that clause in contracts. And this is just to show, the declining effectiveness of unions. So work stoppages, this is really the most important tool in the union toolkit, is the strike. When workers go on strike, that forces the firm's hand, forces them to negotiate with the union. And unions used to strike quite a bit. You see numbers in the high 100s as recently as the 80s, but they have gone down. They have zeroed out in some years recently. Although I should note this is somewhat changing. We'll have to see again. All bets are off in the COVID era, but over the last year, there have been big strikes, especially by teachers. So the picture is maybe changing. American workers are maybe more likely to be striking in future years, but again, all bets are off. With respect to the IT revolution, I'm not sure it's a problem per se. For a lot of people, these are, this is a great thing. These are jobs that you can do with a college education, and you can even do them even in the pre-COVID era. People who were able to work from their home in their pajamas, just using their brains all day. You don't get dirty. You don't risk being sucked up into a machine. But there are certain problems associated with this. This makes it so that less educated workers have fewer options to go into the workforce, because if you don't have computer skills, you're at a significant disadvantage. And of course, we know that disadvantages certain populations. So people from very rural areas, people from inner cities with poor quality education have fewer opportunities. And even for those workers who work in these IT jobs, telecommuters face workplace isolation. Well, and not just telecommuters too. So the telecommuters, but also the folks who work in cubicles don't get much in the way of human interaction, and we know that that's not healthy for people. I think you've probably seen, as we've all been locked into our homes over the last few weeks now, there's all sorts of counseling of, how do you get a human connection? And, people having watch parties for Netflix shows, or getting together with people on Teams or Google Meet, right, to try to get that human connection. We know that that's important for people, and that you can lose that when you spend all day working on your computer. Also, increased surveillance, meaning that your boss can literally be, listening in on your phone calls or looking at what you're doing on your desktop if you work in a computer-driven workplace. And again, kind of back towards that automation point, this is, partly potentially de-skilling the workforce and replacing some workers. So if you're a programmer, often what you're programming is ways that the computers can do things like compile spreadsheets that human beings used to do. So it ultimately may yield fewer jobs for people. So let me just double check. Nothing, questions in the chat. Okay. So turning towards theory, and now I'm wondering what this guy is doing, because this is a musical instrument here, so I don't know what all is going on here. But again, turning out to the theory, functionalism, and you'll still see, again, I think I've mentioned, functionalism tends to be a fairly dated set of theories, but just how we think about work, and how you see people writing about it again in the current climate. It thinks about work as it is attuned to all kinds of different dimensions of our lives. So right now, when those of us who can work are working out of our houses, you see that this is a really strange arrangement. You're probably all, I can look at some of you. You're working, in your family home. Mom and dad, I assume, are upstairs trying to do their jobs. And I hope you're not annoying them, asking them to make you peanut butter and jelly sandwiches or things like that. We're really not used to having work in the home. And that's actually, historically a relatively new thing. We used to have work in the home. We used to mostly be farmers, or if you were a blacksmith, you worked at your house. We changed everything around, and now that we're working back at our homes, we think it's really strange, right? So much of our social order really is attuned to the way that we do work. Also, from the interactionist point of view, work is important to identity, at least for that may be as a sort of an ideal for some people. People with good jobs, I identify as a college professor, right? That's a very salient part of my identity. Lawyers, that's a salient part of who they are. They take it seriously. They take pride in that. Of course, you see right now, we're talking about doctors and nurses as being these heroes, and they can take that as a salient part of their identity and really be proud of that. That's not so much available to people in lower skill jobs. So the person who works on an assembly line, or the person who's a janitor, may not. Sometimes they do, certainly. Sometimes they take that seriously and take pride in their work and take it as an important part of their identity. But if they feel that their work is unimportant, or if they kind of bounce from job to job, they may be spending a lot of time doing things that they really don't feel proud of, and that can lead to other various problems in their lives. Ideally, your work is part of a career, and this is also a symbolic interactionist idea in general. The whole idea of career is that your identity and your skills over time get built up and lead sort of logically from one thing to the next. Your Marxists, of course, you know, and like I said, there's lots of different Marxists, but we can generally say they look at work as an exploitative relationship. The capitalist, the person who owns the firm, you know, is ultimately getting money out of their workers, right? They magically make money by having this class of people, the working class, who have to go and work for capitalists. And you know, because they have no choice, that allows the capitalists to take money out of them. More generally, we talked about alienation, you know, and they do see, you know, it's funny if you go back and you read the Marx, I want to say this is in the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844. You know, he talks about like, well, what people should really be doing is like hunting and fishing and farming and making pipes and things, and kind of bouncing from thing to thing and just doing stuff that they love in order to keep, you know, a community alive. You know, again, really communism, working for a community. And if you don't do that, you don't feel very good. And there's still, you know, quite a heavy strain of that in sociology, who says, you know, well, you know, people don't like their work a lot. Of course, feminism looks at the workforce, and we have looked at some of this, you know, so the gender typing of jobs, you know, tends to reinforce certain kinds of gender stereotypes. You know, I've seen it lately where, you know, somebody will mention, you know, somebody online says that somebody is a nurse, that the general assumption tends to be that that person is a woman. And if not, then that causes this cognitive dissonance. And that also gets reflected then in compensation, where jobs that are typed for women tend to pay less than male jobs, right? So this, you know, just again, a real kind of cogent demonstration of the gender typing in our society. Looking politically, and again, I've kind of mentioned some of this throughout, but you know, the liberal position, generally speaking, is that the government has an important role to play in the regulation of work. That's, you know, a very general point. So that would be things like the health and safety legislation that, you know, that tends to be more popular amongst liberals. So, you know, the rules that OSHA puts in place to protect workers, but also things like the regulation of financial services, the regulation of really how banks and businesses are allowed to do business. You know, especially you look at somebody like Elizabeth Warren, you know, who has crafted a lot of legislation over the years to limit what banks can do, in part really with the ultimate idea of, as you saw, unemployment shoots up during those recessions, to try to limit the impact of those recessions. So by doing that, or by regulating the financial services industry, would be the idea that you lessen the harm of those recessions on workers. Liberals, though, also support wage guarantees. You know, that, you know, would be essentially the minimum wage. Although I should note, well, people in both parties in recent years have supported raising the minimum wage. Obviously, liberals support raising it much more than conservatives, but still there has not been legislative action at the national level or in a lot of states. So certain states, and this is really kind of a way to tell whether a state is more or less liberal, is if they have a significantly higher state minimum wage than the federal minimum wage. That tends to be a very liberal position. Of course, progressive taxation, as I mentioned before, taxing highly paid workers more than low wage workers, ultimately with the idea of taking that taxed money and putting it into, well, largely entitlement programs, to some extent, things like infrastructure. Liberals, historically, the Democratic Party in particular, has been pro-union. Unions tend to support Democratic candidates. They tend to work pretty hand in glove together. And liberals also support, right, expanding education, right? So paying more for different kinds of state-provided education. Conservatives, on the other hand, generally oppose most of those things, oppose regulation in general, arguing that, along with classical economists, that government regulation interferes with free markets, and that free market competition spurs innovation and allows more people in the society to earn more money generally. So when you regulate things, you get less economic activity, and that hurts poor people as well as rich people. Right, there you go. Free markets promote hard work. That's also the idea, right? That and it goes along with a sort of a emphasis on individual responsibility. That if you raise the minimum wage, or if you provide more welfare to people, that will discourage people from working as hard, as hard as they can. And so that's a reason not to have those kind of entitlement programs. Social movements, there are work movements, and if you look at, again, I teach this course on social movements now. If you look back at the social movements literature, we really look at labor unions as social movements with the goal of supporting workers, or making workers' lives easier, or making them better compensated. And so unions include AFSCME, which now I'm forgetting, but it's that's basically the public services union in a lot of states. Is AFSCME. So if you work for a state or municipal government, you're likely to be unionized with them, especially if you're up north. SEIU is probably the fastest growing labor union. That's the Service Employees International Union, and they actually they unionize some odd things. So as service employees, as the name suggests, they tend to unionize people in services, so things like hotel workers. But they're also, I know in Florida, they've unionized a number of municipal government workers, and they unionize things like graduate student unions at certain big universities. Although some of them are aligned with the UAW, which is the United Auto Workers, which was traditionally one of the biggest, most powerful unions. Teamsters are the union of well, traditionally truckers, but again, they cover other things. And the NEA is the National Education Association. That's for teachers, mostly K-12 teachers. And what they favor, again, are workers' rights, collective bargaining, workplace regulations to make work safer, or to make give people the opportunity to take breaks, and of course higher wages for workers. There are, of course, conservative movement organizations, though. The Chamber of Commerce represents business interests in general. The National Retail Federation is, for retailers, for businesses that sell things to the public. National Association of Manufacturers is for those who make things. And these organizations, generally are anti-union, favor things like right to work laws that make union activity more difficult, and they oppose any kinds of regulation, whether that's things like workplace safety or product safety or various kinds of EPA environmental regulations. That's not to say that they only worry about business. So they also, both of those, the National Retail Federation and National Association of Manufacturers, are concerned about the opioid crisis, because that puts people out of the workforce and makes fewer people able to buy stuff and keep work going. And also they're concerned about a lower skill workforce. There is concern now, amongst, both liberals and conservatives, that the American educational system is not doing a great job educating the next generation. A couple of questions here. So what happens after the pandemic? Nobody knows, right? It's a real problem. Will it affect productivity? I mean, what happened after the last recession was that you saw increased worker productivity, which means that more workers, or fewer workers are working, but they're working harder. I don't see any reason to expect anything different this time, but the sudden turnaround of the GOP, Republicans, to support things like drastically expanded unemployment benefits, suggest that we're really at a unique moment in legislative history now. So I don't know what happens next. I mean, there could even be government work programs to get people back to work like there were in the 1930s. I think everything's on the table, so we just kind of have to wait and see. Mentally, what the workforce looks like, it could be incredibly depressing. I mean, so like the Great Depression, a lot of people out of work does not mean a happy country, and also we know that that can go on to lead to things like the conditions that led up to the Second World War, right? A really discontented, unhappy populace can give way over to populist, even fascist leaders. Whether, I don't know if that's a real concern for America, but that could cause conflict globally. And really that was what got us out of the Great Depression, was the Second World War. Ultimately, I hope nothing comes to that. I hope we've learned our lessons, but I see no reason for unbounded optimism yet. And how do teachers' unions clash with charter schools? I mean, that's an interesting question, right? And I think part of the reason that teachers are so opposed to charter schools is that those schools tend not to be unionized, right? And this does go to a sort of a basic self-interest thing that leads to a lot of the critiques of unions. Unions want to keep unions going, and so they feel threatened by charter schools. I think there is some, legitimate concern about the educational quality of charter schools, but also clearly part of the reason that teachers' unions are militating against charter schools is that it's simply a threat to the union. Those schools don't have union teachers, and so that shrinks the size of the union more generally. And I think we're right. Yeah. So wrapping up, right? So you'll be aware that even in normal times, up to before the COVID scare, the COVID crisis, the nature of work has been changing. Expect that work continues to become more technologically based. I don't think we're going to go back to having an industrial workforce. But, could I see maybe we develop, some kind of national factory system to ensure that we don't face the kind of shortages that we're facing now? I mean, again, anything could be on the table. Have some sense. Certainly, there is good stories out there. There are good jobs to be had. I know you all want them, and seniors, I hope you're able to secure them. Again, once this all blows over. But again, of course, there are plenty of bad jobs out there. Definitely recognize that unions are have been in decline. Maybe maybe they're ascendant again, and particularly maybe after so many people are unemployed, there will be a sort of a new thinking about unions. Again, we just don't know. Next time, we are going to do a midterm review. Again, the second midterm will be on Thursday, a week from today. So Tuesday will be a review, and I'm going to try to set something up on Moodle so we can kind of have some synchronous participation in the forums there to put together those kind of summaries, and maybe we'll do like tiny Google Meets to the side of the main Google Meet. So next time is review. So, bring also any, take at least a quick look at your notes and the text, and come with questions if any come up. Have a great Thursday and a good weekend, and hope your social distancing is pleasant. And
Good question.
yeah.
What is the format of the test, and what platform will we be taking it on? I missed the first 20 minutes of the first class.
Right. The format is the same, I guess, as the with 20 short answers and then 2 out of 3 essays, but you'll be taking it on Moodle. And it'll be timed, 90 minutes, unless you had accommodations, in which case you'll get folks will get extra time.
So how would I go about putting my accommodations in place for a Moodle test? About that, or the Center of Academic Excellence?
I've actually done that for everyone who has the accommodations.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Have a good one, guys.